You're listening to Balancing Point. I'm Trevor Filseth, and this is my colleague Dr. Armand Mahmoodian. For more than a decade now, the regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela has survived through a mix of coercion, patronage, institutional capture, and external hedging. It remains unclear if that style of government has come to an end for Venezuela, but it's certainly come to an end for Maduro. Early on Saturday morning, 1 week ago today, the Venezuelan leader was abducted by Delta Force commandos in a raid codenamed Operation Absolute Resolve. He was taken from his presidential compound in Caracas, flown to New York City, and is now on trial in the Southern District of New York on charges of drug trafficking. His apparent successor is former Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who initially took a hard line against President Trump, but has since expressed a willingness to work with him. So, when a regime that looks durable collapses or is rapidly displaced, the real question isn't just how that happened, it's what comes next. Who actually holds power now? Who can enforce order? Of the country's major issues, economics, migration, organized crime, the fractured political opposition, how will those be affected? And for Washington, what does success in Venezuela look like without triggering the very chaos that it claims to prevent? So to help us make sense of these dynamics, we're very pleased to be joined by two experts who have spent their whole careers studying how states and societies behave under pressure, especially when legitimacy breaks and power transitions become contested. So first, Dr. Robert Burrell is an interdisciplinary scholar of resilience and resistance. His frameworks for identifying and measuring resistance support ongoing special research projects at U.S. Central Command, and he is a 2025 fellow with the Irregular Warfare Initiative. Since 2024, he served as a senior research fellow with the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. From 2020 to 2024, he taught irregular warfare at the Joint Special Operations University, and earlier served as U.S. Special Operations Command's editor-in-chief for Irregular Warfare Doctrine. A retired Marine with multiple combat tours, Dr. Burrell has spent 12 years living and working across Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, plus a diplomatic tour of the U.S. Embassy in Australia. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Warwick and master's degrees from San Diego State and the U.S. Naval War College. We're also pleased to be joined by Dr. Homer Harkins, a faculty member of the United Arab Emirates War College in Abu Dhabi. Prior to this role, Dr. Harkins served on the facility of the Joint Special Operations University at MacDill Air Force Base, where he held positions from instructor to Dean of Academics and Director of the Center for Irregular Warfare. A retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, he served as an infantry officer, a Special Forces officer, and a Latin American Foreign Area officer. In 2015, he earned his doctorate in education, and his earlier education includes a BBA, an MA in Computer Resources and Information Management, and an MS in International Relations. I'm also told that in his glory days, he was military freefall qualified and a master parachutist and an Army Ranger. So we're very pleased to have both of you here today. This promises to be an excellent and informative panel. And with that, I will turn things over to Armand.
Well, thank you, Trevor. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to both Dr. Burrell and Dr. Harkins for being here. Well, I'm not expert of the Venezuela, so like many others, I'm here to learn from you, gentlemen. But I want to say that to our audience that I had the privilege of, before starting this, podcast, having a short conversation with Dr. Harkins, in which he mentions about how countries with the oil-rich countries can have a different experience, and having oil is not necessarily a guarantee for a success. And he pointed out to the case of Venezuela, which actually I want to take the conversation that we have today to the very beginning of the crisis in the Venezuela, and asking you, Dr. Harkins, starting with you, in your experience, how was Venezuela under, let's say that if we can call it a socialist rule of the Chavez and then Maduro, how the system functions? Why was it at some point it seemed to have economic
demonstrates how the
it seems that at some point they had a growth, but then they started the decline in their economy. And what changed? What brought Venezuela to the current stage economically, socially, and politically?
Well, I think if you want to know the present, you've got to look at the past. And I don't want to go too far back, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think you can model the experience relevant to the present in kind of three phases, going back about 100 years to when oil became a significant commodity. And the first 40 years of that period, Venezuela experienced unimaginable economic progress. I mean, literally more impressive than what we now think of China as. And it went from a relatively poor Latin American country to, by some accounts, having the third highest per capita income in the world. That's impressive. Now, it was done under basically a military dictatorship. So as an American, I don't like that, but it did have a way of keeping a lot of the corruption and such under control and keeping things orderly, marching in the right direction. But as what often happens with progress, you started to see an emerging middle class, upper middle class, young, educated men who thought, really, Venezuela should be like the developed countries. And one of the criteria to be part of those is to be democratic. And so at great risk, they brought democracy to Venezuela. And we entered the second phase, which I would call the democratization, from about 1960 to the year 2000. Almost immediately, the growth rate started to kind of taper off, like an artillery round would be. I'm not sure exactly why. I think a lot of the economic questions involved, the way they implemented the economic strategy were flawed, created a lot of debt, a lot of economic drag. The corruption really got out of control. Suddenly, if you wanted to convict somebody of corruption, you had to take them to a court of law and due process and such. So it kind of got out of control. And you started to see the emergence of a lot of social frustration. And I think it's the so what of the first period is a lot of Venezuelans my age and a little bit younger really were aware of how successful Venezuela was, and they aspired to going back to that. So you go through the second phase of democratization, and through the democratic process, a very charismatic young fellow by the name of Hugo Chavez, an Army lieutenant colonel, very intelligent, very charismatic, very visionary, and also a dyed-in-the-wool dedicated communist, a true believer in communism, was able to kind of cultivate a political movement within the military, which, according to him, at the height of it, was 10% of the military professional officer and NCO Corps. And they kind of used this, the driving ideology was, we are going to save Venezuela from the economic demise that we feel. He was able to get elected. He actually launched a military coup, a good old-fashioned military coup as a young lieutenant colonel, in which about 25 young soldiers were killed and about 50 were crippled and sent to the hospital. And he and his three conspirators, other lieutenant colonels, were looking to 30 years in prison. But because of the political dynamics, the next presidential candidate in line said, I understand why these young men did it. They were wrong, but they meant right, so I'm going to pardon them. And that was kind of the icing on the cake that was needed to really turn Hugo Chavez into a folk hero. And within 6 years, he was the president of Venezuela. And we need to understand that the man was a communist. He was a firm believer in communism. The first thing he did when he got out of prison was fly to Havana to see Fidel Castro. And if you probably read some of the news lately, the bodyguard perimeter around Hugo Chavez or Maduro, the president, the dictator of Venezuela, were Cubans. So Chavez, in some ways, he was able to kind of rally the resources, and there was a splurge in oil money that gave him just enough economic energy to do two things. One, to reinstill some kind of effective social welfare net for a while, which inspired the masses. And number two, give the private sector, in essence, deals they could not refuse. We're going to buy your factory for what we think is a fair price. Take it or leave it, but we're going to get your factory. And so he used that money to basically gut the private market. And then by the devil's luck, he died of cancer. And on his deathbed, he turned the revolution over to Maduro. He told the people, you need to elect this man. He needs to be my follow-on leader. And at the same time, the money ran out. Basically, it just, and then the whole country was in free fall. There was no real private economy. The oil money was gone. There for about 4 years, about the only game in town was drugs. So I mean, literally, the place was making more money off of narcotics flow than they were off of oil money. And so the whole thing kind of got to be very corrupt and dark. You may know about, by some accounts, a third of Venezuelans have left the country because it just became so hopeless. In 2008, at the height of the surge in Iraq, there were more violent deaths per capita in Venezuela than there were in Iraq. Now, look it up. And so that's the kind of social dysfunction we're talking about, which causes a third of the population to run. So what you have left is a very kind of dark architecture that controls what's left of the power, it controls the guns, and that's where we are. And a tripping point was last year we were able to kind of impose an election on Venezuela, the international community. It became pretty obvious that Maduro lost it horribly, and he just ignored the results. And at that point, it just became this obvious, blatant dictatorship. All facade of a law and order gone, and it was presented to the new president Trump, and he decided to take action, and we saw what happened on the 3rd of January, and now the games begin. So,
before turning it back to the travel, I have just a quick follow-up question. When you mentioned Chavez buys the factories, so with the set price, it seems to be that the way that he approached the state's control over the economy was kind of different about the good old communist way, with just they nationalized, as they did in Soviet Union after Russian Empire. So just the state took over. Was it any particular reason that he tried to buy it out instead of just taking over?
Well, he didn't have the power. I lived in Venezuela 5 years. I had 2 military tours in Venezuela. My first was 3 years. I'm sorry, it was 2 years. As an exchange officer with our special forces. I actually parachute jumped with Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez. I was there during the first coup. I know all of the lieutenant colonels involved, and the second I was there for 3 years, right after Chavez was elected, and it was at this time there were still very powerful institutions, and at that time there'd probably been 35 years of democracy, so it wasn't as if you could just walk in and take over. Right. Let's remember in 2002, when the people of Venezuela, at least many of them, realized that they were dealing with a true communist, they basically rose up in mass demonstrations. And by some accounts, it was the largest demonstration that had ever been held in the Western Hemisphere in April 2002. And they forced Chavez to resign. I mean, he resigned the presidency, and they were negotiating to leave. So he had lost basically, and suddenly through kind of a Keystone Cop, he was brought back. But that actually also exposed a lot who were willing to work against him, exposed a lot who were willing to support him, and from then he was really able to kind of consolidate power. But I guess in short, what I want to say, he didn't have dictatorial power, right? Even when he died in 2013, he was not yet a true dictator. It wasn't until after that things got really hardcore under Maduro. And when you really saw the Cubans step in, and I'll just purely speculate and say, when Chavez came down with cancer, I think the Cubans killed him. I think that they saw this is the time to make a transition, and they basically installed Maduro. And they took over. They basically saturated the architecture with Cuban intelligence agents. Every military base had Cubans, counterintelligence, and they just kind of, the iron fist came in and took over. So Hugo Chavez played the game very well. By the time he died, there was no game. It was basically they controlled the guns, they controlled the power, and came up. So.
Going off of that, I had sort of a question, which is, it's not easy to control a kind like a dictatorship under any circumstances, and particularly when sort of Venezuela was facing all the crises that it was. So prior to Saturday, I mean, Venezuela was broke. The economy was in free fall. But as you said, a third of the people had left. It was the subject of these massive international sanctions, and there was unrest from sort of the obviously fraudulent election the year before. And so, given all of that, even so, it seemed like Maduro did a very, very good job of keeping the regime together. So, like, how did he do that? What were the factors at play here? Did he have a domestic loyal power base? Obviously he was able to get enough money to pay off the security forces. Was it just a function of stuff like that, where as a third world?
This is the Cubans. They're very good at controlling a society. They've mastered that game, it's repression. I think we who live in the West, and maybe Armand is from Iran, so he's got a sense of what this kind of stuff is like. But we in the West are just totally naive to what it's like to live in a place where you really fear the state, that the knock on the door at night may not be a good thing. And if you want to control 1,000 men, just take one out, put him up against the wall and shoot him. And the other 999 will do what you say. We kind of, oh, come on. But it was really that hardball-ish. Particularly after the Cubans just basically said, we're going to take over. I don't think it's really an exaggeration to say that the power structure that kept Maduro in office stemmed from Havana.
I see. I do want to bring in Dr. Burrell here as well. Let me ask you this, Doctor. So the election, correct me if I'm wrong, was in 2024, and it was just cartoonishly fraudulent. Everybody understood that Edmundo Gonzalez had won, and Maduro just didn't like that. So there's this election, and then Trump comes into office, and almost right away he starts building up troops around Venezuela. He sends aircraft carriers to the Caribbean. He sort of starts, flying stealth planes over Venezuela and this sort of thing. And January 3rd, 2026 was when he decided to send in the special forces to go and get Maduro. So to the best that anyone can tell, like, why did he decide to do that when he did? There's some rumors out there on the internet that, like, he saw a video of Maduro dancing on TV and he didn't like that. So it's like, oh, well, let's just grab him. But that doesn't seem like a very compelling explanation on its own. So do you have any grasp of sort of the strategic logic that explains the timing here? Like, are there any political factors to think about? Was he under domestic pressure or anything like that?
Well, thank you for the question. So in July of 2024, when Maria Corina Machado was able to win the election with Edmundo Gonzalez, and then she was able to validate it really with a grassroots network of women. Mothers were like a huge part of this network because they saw their children leave. They couldn't see their grandchildren. 9 million Venezuelans had left. They were very passionate about bringing people home that had flown away from the dictatorship. But when she was able to show the ballot, she was able to show all the numbers, right? It totally delegitimized Nicolas Maduro. So I would say that point is really the trajectory that got us here today. That was the major culminating point, because Maduro had falsified the last election as well, but nobody could prove it, right? So now it's proven he's a dictator. And then in October, Dr. Armand Mahmoodian and I both published last year, October 2024, that this was going to happen. And the next thing we said was going to happen was Iran is going to happen. So, that's over a year ago that we published that. And how did we get to that assessment? It wasn't about Trump. It was about Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio has a huge track record of supporting democracy and freedom and human rights abroad. And he's published a bunch of it. And he's also brought up a lot of legislation in the Senate, right? And the three major topics are Venezuela, Iran, and China. Those are the things that he's published on, and that's what we predicted. So when we get into the Trump administration, starting in January of last year, Marco Rubio has been steering this train to confront Venezuela from the beginning of the administration. First, they got 60 nations to validate that Edmundo Gonzalez was the president. That's a big deal. That is a big deal and a huge effort. And he flew all over Latin America trying to get votes to, trying to get these countries and the elected leaders of these countries to throw in their lot with Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, and a large number of them did. Also, when you see Trump's policy with we lost him.
Yeah, he will join us, but the program.
Okay, come back.
When you look at Trump's economic policy, he spent U.S. dollars to prop up the Argentinian economy. That was another attempt to make sure that regimes in the Western Hemisphere were aligned with the U.S., which meant that they were more conservative to the right regimes, but that was his attempt to do that. One of the countries that has fallen in support of the U.S. is Bolivia. Believe that or not, Bolivia, which is one of the most leftist regimes for so long. I think that's where we got Che Guevara, right? So this is a very leftist regime, a very corrupt regime, turned to the right, became conservative, and is supporting the U.S. intervention in Venezuela. This is a titanic shift. And Peru just changed to the right as well and threw out their president. So there's a lot of political dynamics that occurred during the first half of 2025 that weren't military in nature, right? Mm-hmm. And then you had the Nobel Peace Prize, which got even more attention to Maria Corina Machado. And so, it takes a long time to form this coalition, come up with this strategy, deploy forces. I mean, Homer and I lived this for decades. You don't just hit the button and suddenly the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit goes into the Caribbean. There's all types of things that have to happen. There's only 3 Marine Expeditionary Units abroad at any time, and so when you change the rotation of one to go somewhere, that leaves a gap somewhere else. I mean, this has to be planned in advance, and so you saw the buildup, you saw the confrontation coming, but I think this was the big right hook. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was this unexpected jab or whatever. This was coming, right? And it started with the selection of Marco Rubio, but once Trump became president, we were going down this road, right? Or else, if we didn't, then Armand and I would have been completely wrong. So we're not geniuses. We're just able to read the tea leaves. Does that answer your question?
I think it does answer his question, but the problem that you created. Now I have a question for you before going to the Dr. Harkins. So, for our audiences, Dr. Robert Burrell is expert of resistance and resiliency. And now I have a question regarding the resiliency part, which is a state's capacity to confront and suppress the people or any resistance from the public. Rob, based on what Homer mentioned about the Cuban takeover and Cuban presence in security apparatus of Venezuela, I think we are seeing a tendency since the December of 2024. And which is the fall of Assad's regime. And why I'm bringing Syria is that in Syria also the security apparatus was largely maintained or at least supervised by non-Syrian elements, being as an Iranian or the Lebanese. I mean, I remember I met a friend of mine from the Middle East, and he said that, do you want me to tell you 3 wars in a row that they all are lie? I said, yes. He said, that's Syrian Arab army. It's no longer Syrian, it's no longer Arab, and it's not the army even. And we saw the collapse of the Syria once the pressure came in the December. And now it seems that we saw at least a U.S. successful removal of the Maduro. The question that I have for you regarding the resilience of the Assad, do you think Venezuela, do you think the presence of the Cubans made an impact, evidently negative impact on the morale of and the way that the Venezuelans used to maintain the security of the country, or it had nothing to do with them? This was coming, with Cuban being there or not being there, this would have happened.
Well, I think Homer has an opinion on Cuba that I don't. I'm data centric, right? So I'm trying to find hard data and things, and there's a little bit more nebulous with Cuba. I think what you see around the Maduro regime was the ghost of Hugo Chavez. In fact, if you go to the National Assembly, there's a picture right next to Simon Bolivar of Hugo Chavez. I mean, it's like, and all the folks that are in power, the Chavistas there, they're all the remnants of Hugo Chavez. And sometimes, you create this kind of incestuous environment where you're going on a trajectory and there's no way off it, right? They just keep like more suppression. They're trying to keep their own power base, and they can't change directions. And I think the removal of Maduro is facilitating, we can actually make a shift. And so I think in that shift, there's 2 major factions that are going to come to a head at some point. One is the Rodriguez coalition is the word I'm using for it, but it's Delcy Rodriguez and her brother Jorge, who is now the president of the National Assembly. Both of those individuals are not under indictment in the U.S. They're not great people. They brutally suppress the population, but they're not under criminal indictment. And then you have what I'm calling the indicted faction, and that's the defense minister and the interior minister, particularly Diosdado Cabello, who controls the colectivos. I mean, the colectivos, which is these local militias on motorcycles, they're the suppression arm. I mean, they're the ones where you can't come outside, right? It's not the soldier in uniform. In fact, the soldiers in uniform, if you look at the last election, they were very professional. They're extremely professional. They didn't like brutally suppress votes or anything like that. It's the colectivos doing all that madness. And also the colectivos are on the payroll. So how does that stop? I mean, there's a lot of questions about how to transition, and it could go very bad. It could go pear-shaped like Libya, where you got 2 major factions going after each other. I will say that the ethnic makeup, the tribal kind of makeup in Libya is far different from far different, and the two major cities, Benghazi and Tripoli, are far different from what you see in Venezuela, where Caracas is kind of the center of moving everything. So I think as it moves forward, Caracas will be the heartbeat of where transition goes, and we'll see what happens next week when Corina Machado comes to meet with Trump. I think he likes that. I think she's extremely intelligent and charismatic. I think there'll be a great connection there. And then maybe we'll see him advocating for more of her involvement. But I want to go back to something that Homer said, and that is the corruption. There is so much. Venezuela is one of the most corrupt places in the world right now. That's not an easy shift. When you make your money or you do your business every day in a corrupt fashion, it's not easy to get back to, okay, everything's gonna be upright and on the table, and I'm not gonna fleece people anymore. So, how does Venezuela make that turn? It's gonna be a challenge. You couldn't find a better unifying leader than Corina Machado, so that might help. But at the same time, the 20% of the population that remains Chavista and the folks who retain power, which are Chavista, are not going to like that turn. So, there is going to be some conflict there.
Thank you, Robert. And Homer, back to you. You're similar to Robert. You both are a military man, but you serve in Venezuela. What happened in Venezuela last week is, militarily speaking, I believe, I'm not a military man, so correct me if I'm wrong, but can be considered as almost a masterpiece. No casualty from the American side, removal of the head of the state, but this is not the first time that happens. I mean, we had, a foreign country comes quickly to change or attempt to change the leadership. I think in 1940s, we have the great example of the Germans' Operation Asche for Italy, that Joachim Peppier played a role in it to restore the Mussolini. In most cases, there is a resistance, and at least it takes a while, and it doesn't just removal goes as smooth as it went for you guys in Venezuela. What advantages aside U.S. military capability? Because U.S. military might always been there. It also was there during the Cuban intervention, which failed during the JFK. What changed today? What was the trump card that the United States had to change everything?
This gets back to back 1980, right, where wise men thought the United States has got a lot of responsibilities in a strategic sense, and we need to have a special tool for special operations. And we created a suite of special mission units that would focus exclusively on being able to pull off special operations. And we've seen them just succeed time and time again in unimaginable ways. And a lot of the stuff that's coming out now about the raid, I mean, today Trump posted an interview with a Venezuelan soldier. And I don't even know if it was Trump in this age of disinformation, but let's assume for a minute that it was. And I actually saw the young soldier being interviewed talking in Spanish, and it wasn't word for word, but the technology that we had was just unimaginable. This guy was saying that it may maybe 20 Americans, but they were, at one point, there was this one weapon that went off, and all of the Venezuelans basically are in concussion, their noses are bleeding, and they just, I think what I'm trying to get at is, in that arena of special operations, surgical strike, we've just reached a level of proficiency that is almost science fiction like. However, that's one tool in a very complex toolkit. And I think the idea that we're going to do that again and again and again, that could lead to a Mogadishu, right, where we kept trying to do the same and those same. So I wouldn't want to overplay that, but I think that's what it was. It was just we had that tool. And now I do believe that what propped up the regime was the Cubans. It was. But that was kind of a bluff. As we see, it was a bluff. And we called the bluff on 3 January, and it turned out to be a bluff. And so that architecture has collapsed. It's gone. And the question is, what comes next? And again, Rob's the expert on this, but most of the academic research that talks about transition from thugocracy or dictatorship to democracy recognizes you got to work with the tools you've got, the bureaucracy you've got, the institutions you've got. You have to get enough of them to say, okay, we're willing to give democracy a chance if you're going to make it work. And so I think that's the game right now. And if I were playing the card I would play to Rodriguez is, they had elections in Nicaragua in 1992. People voted out the communist Sandinistas. Well, 6 years later, they won the election. They came back in power. Now, insensibly, they haven't left power, right? But at least the idea is, Delcy Rodriguez is a true believer. She believes that communism is the answer. And I could see her becoming the head of an opposition party in essence, right? And letting the Democratic game begin. And we talk about the guy that runs Colombia right now is an old communist guerrilla, right? So that's the game of democracy. I was in El Salvador during the Civil War. Well, the FMLN communist guerrillas became the party of the left, right? And they won elections, lost elections. And so I can see appeal to them on those lines. And Rob talked about the collectives, and they are a very powerful force, but it's a force for anarchy, right?
Mhm.
And one of the phenomena that's happening now, my wife is Venezuelan. All of her friends in Venezuela have gone silent. You can't get anything out of them. If you look back in the narrative, about 2 days ago, they passed a law that said anyone who says on social media that they support this action, if we find you on social media, you go to prison for 30 years. And now the collectives are out there telling people, give me your cell phone, open it up, right? And now it's a bluff. Maybe it's not. I mean, today they're talking about releasing political prisoners, but that kind of repression is right out of the Cuban playbook, right? All you got to do is put one person in prison because of something they found on their cell phones, and people stop talking to their cell phones. So it'll be interesting to see. And I think Rob hit the nail on the head. You've got these two dynamics within the establishment, right? The establishment that's willing to give democracy a shot and see what happens, let the games begin. And the establishment that says, no, we're not going to play that game. I know for me, it's not going to turn out well. Diosdado Cabello knows if law and order returns to Venezuela, he's going to spend the rest of his life in a very dark jail cell in New York City. I mean, he doesn't want that, right? So, and that's kind of where we're at right now. And we'll see what happens.
So,
Thank you.
suppose for a minute that you're Delcy Rodriguez, and again, one of the most curious aspects of this whole business has been there was the raid. It took out Maduro. It killed, some of the Cubans around him. It didn't substantially seem to have an impact on Chavismo writ large. I mean, the rest of the government is still intact. Now it's not like they parachuted in Maria Corina Machado to be their leader. So you're Delcy Rodriguez. You're where Maduro used to be. You have control over the same organs of power that he did. I mean, I gather Cabello controls the colectivos, but Cabello is working with you, at least for the time being. So, like, what incentive do you have if you're sort of in a position like that and you can manage the transition to democracy? Why would you do that? I mean, it seems like Rodriguez's position now is fairly comfortable, right? It's not as though Cabello is threatening to mutiny against her or anything like that. And being the new president, she has control over sort of the same levers that Maduro did. She's the beneficiary of corruption. She has sort of the military's backing. I mean, is there anything that the United States could do to push her to
Yes,
organize
and we're doing it. I mean, and it's kind of obvious. We're preventing the flow of oil. We're seizing the oil. We're now taking to New Orleans and selling it. Right. We stopped the flow of drug money. We had an air cap, so you can't fly stuff out. We're blowing up the ships on. Yes, it's called hardball. Right. It's called hardball. And I think that the writing's on the wall, and they understand. And I will say that I don't really. I believe that it was Rubio pushing this direct action, right? Because I think Rubio does believe in liberty. He is more of a liberalist in his international view. I don't think Trump could care less about that. Trump is very clear. He wants the drugs to stop coming. He wants the oil to come, and he wants foreign influence out of the hemisphere. That's what he wants. If you want to know what Trump wants, read the national security strategy, right? And it's right there. And if he can get that with democracy in Caracas, great. If he can get that without democracy in Caracas, great. I mean, I just think that's where he is. He's the most realistic president in my lifetime. But I also, I'm talking too much, but I think as a very successful businessman, he knows if you want to run complex organizations, you find the right person for the job and you empower them to do the job. And that's what he does. Whether it's Kennedy with all of this stuff about health and immunizations, or it's, if it's Rubio and whether or not we should go into Venezuela, he lets people, he gives them the authority, and he kind of sits back and lets things go. I mean, so I do believe a lot of this is, in fact, as Rob said, being kind of controlled by Rubio. Trump has said, Marco, this is your job, right? You know what I want? As long as I get it, right? Drugs stop coming, oil starts coming, Russians, Chinese, Iranians out, I'm happy. And Marco's saying, okay, boss, I think this is the way to do it. So
yeah, Homer's right on that, on his initial point there about the oil. If you it's huge leverage. The regime right now, I mean, when you think about their power, it looks like a powerful position. They have 120,000 active duty soldiers. How do they pay them? Those guys are not going to go to work without cash. They have to feed their families, right? And yesterday, Trump said that the regime had a couple weeks. He's really good at leaking classified information, by the way. So he got that figure from somewhere. The regime's got a couple weeks worth of funding, and then they won't have any more cash. So the nefarious characters who have billions of dollars that they've stolen from the country are not going to use their own cash to keep things going. That's not what they do. So Delcy Rodriguez needs money. And so that's the leverage. He's going to initially sell this initial crude that's been seized. And he's already said he's going to give some back to Delcy Rodriguez, because the regime that has all the levers of control needs funding. The other piece, which is huge, and it's going to be interesting to see what some of the neighbors think of this, particularly Colombia, is Trump is promising $100 billion investment into oil infrastructure. That is enormous incentive to change your political process and make it more democratic. That's a huge investment, which will change the landscape in Venezuela from being the poorest country back to being the richest country in Latin America. It's a huge incentive for the population, for the regime. And I mentioned Colombia because other countries who are turning to the left, like Colombia has, they might be thinking, well, where's my $100 billion, right? And they're all going to be a little jealous, right? And so that's really the leverage. We just didn't use it very well in Iran as well. Is look at Saudi Arabia as this blossoming, burgeoning, amazing country with all of these economic opportunities, great no unemployment, everyone's living the high life, and the exact same resources in Iran, and it's just falling apart, right? And so Iranians are looking at Saudi Arabia going, well, this sucks. Why can't I have what they have? Well, you can. You just change your political process, and you could have the exact same thing. So I think the oil is an enormous amount of leverage, and that's what Trump's going to be using. We'll see how much. And I think Homer's right. I don't think. Well, at least verbally, Trump. I'm a data-centric guy. Trump is not mentioning democracy in Venezuela too much. I'd have to count how many times he says it's about the oil. But he's made it quite clear. I think Rubio, for sure, is going to make that turn. So we'll see how much pressure is actually on the democratic process. Part of it has to be for stabilization. Trump understands that. And so some of the money is going to go back to the Chavistas to maintain control so it doesn't just become, complete chaos in Caracas.
When you mentioned that, you both mentioned about the oil, and specifically speaking, Robert, you're mentioning that Trump maybe is not really big, and I think Homer said the same on the democracy itself. They just want someone from Venezuela who gets things done. Well, the thing about so let's just assume that for better or worse, United States allows a semi-strongman leadership in Venezuela continues, not being fully transit to a democracy. The thing about the semi-strongman or semi-authoritarian regime is you may be able to trust them today, but there is no guarantee 20 years from now or 2 years from now in that manner. The promises will be held. So the question that I have is that what would guarantee that the Venezuelans would stick by their end of the bargain? Let's say that they made a deal with the Americans today, the drug would stop, the oil would come, there would be no foreign influence, Iranian, Russian, or Chinese. But what if in a year or two, they feel comfortable that they restore the order in a sense that now the influence is cemented, they can't call the shot in the Venezuela, and what would stop them to go back their way? Because they remember once you remove their beloved or non-beloved, I don't know to what extent he was popular, Maduro out of the picture. At least you say about a quarter of the country were rooting for it. So what's a guarantee here in your view, to your gentleman?
Well, I'd start with the idea of, do me once, shame on you, do me twice, shame on me. I was there during both coups. And what I saw was an establishment that had no idea of just how evil the enemy they faced is. They just didn't know. And I mean, I'll be very blunt. I mean, the 4 lieutenant colonels that led that coup in 1992, one of them was Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez. They should have put all 4 of them up against the wall and shot them on the morning of 5 February. If they had done that, the lives of millions of Venezuelans would have been different. It would have been the most prosperous country in the world. I mean, the truth is that the Venezuelan security forces failed their people miserably. And I don't think that'll happen again. I think if the devil has gotten back in the bag, it's like the communist who's running Colombia now. He faces police and military who are not going to let him step across the line. If something happens, if he does, bad things are going to happen to him. So I think just the institutional aspect of it, I think, will prevent it from happening again. But in the tactical sense, if I were Diosdado Cabello or Generalissimo Padrino, right, who I think is soon to give himself, he's going to give himself 5 stars because he successfully repelled the American invasion of Venezuela. Okay, I mean, if I was one of those 2 clowns, I would be sleeping with one eye open. Okay, I would be. Both of them are I don't know which one is the ace of spades, right? But one of them is. And they should be very, very, very nervous because that incredible capability we had is still there. And they don't have rings of Cubans protecting them, right? And so, and we have seen, and I've been involved with Latin America for 40 years and listening to people talk about the CIA doing this and American abuse of power, and I've watched, we've been a paper tiger doing nothing, right? Well, suddenly on the 3rd of January, we did something. And at least in the context of Venezuela, now they know what American power is really about. The combination of allowing the institutions to reemerge and reprofessionalize, and the repression with the oil money, right, and sending people involved in drugs to jail, and maybe a couple of surgical strikes on key actors might be enough of the secret sauce to give Venezuela a chance to return to the community of nations. So
I think it's that investment again, the 100 billion, because that's not going to be made by the United States, which is awesome. It's going to be made by U.S. corporations, and they don't make those type of investments unless it's a stable environment. So they're going to require some stability and some accountability from the government, which is going to require them to make reforms. One of the things I think that's going to be key to that is this no more suppression against the population, right? You can't suppress the population. Once that ends, the Chavistas are doomed. Corina Machado can mobilize anytime she wants. You can bring millions of people out in the streets of Caracas to, change the political landscape. They're doomed. If they can't suppress the people anymore, they're doomed. That's their only key to stopping democracy, is getting everybody scared to death inside the country. And so, there could be this could go fairly quickly. I don't know when the timeline is going to happen, but before the $100 billion is invested in new infrastructure and all those things in Venezuela, I think there's going to be some requirements for the current regime to make. And then once you open up Pandora's box to democracy, or at least to stop the suppression, it could be very powerful.
I have, there is a follow-up question that I really need to ask. The name of Cuba is coming a lot. And I believe during the last at least week, we have heard it from a couple of people. We have heard it from Lindsey Graham. We have heard it from also Ricky Scott, that Cuba could be next, or what happened in Caracas can happen, or can and would, or should at least, happen in Havana. So I wanted to, before going back to travel, to ask you two gentlemen quickly, what happened in Venezuela? And I understand, Homer, you already warned that we can reach the Mogadishu episode again if we keep doing this. I want to ask you that, do you think is it possible that the United States, in a close or nearby future, replicate the same operation in Havana?
Again, it gets back to what Trump, what he wants. He wants the drugs to stop flowing. Drugs don't flow through Cuba. Narcotics traffickers do not do well in Cuba, right? There was a famous incident back in '89 where a hero of Cuba, a general, was basically shot live on TV because he's running drugs. So Cuba doesn't do that, right? He wants the oil to flow. Well, Cuba ain't got no oil, right? He wants foreign interference. So that's probably the one thing that Trump wants. He don't want to see the Russians and Chinese sticking their nose in Cuba. But I mean, there's a reason why Cuba had thousands of security operatives in Venezuela, and that was to keep control of the flow of oil into Cuba, right? Well, guess what? That's not happening now, right? So game up as far as that goes. So then the question is, what actually happens when the money disappears in Cuba? I mean, honestly, my concern is that in 6 months, we're talking about tens of thousands of Cubans on boats coming to Miami, right? Remember that one? You guys weren't around, and Rob probably does, but we don't want anarchy in Cuba, right? So you can only push things so far, so in a way, what's left of the regime in Cuba is keeping a lid on what could be a very bad scenario. So I don't know. And I mean, Trump did say, I think it was yesterday, that we don't need to go into Cuba. Cuba will fall on its own, right? And anyhow, that's my thought as far as Cuba. What do you think, Rob?
Well, I totally agree with you. I think going into Cuba is bad for a couple of reasons. One, we don't have any strategic reason to want to go in there. We did in the 60s because the Soviet Union was putting missiles there. That was the reason why we went there. It wasn't because Castro was in power. I think with the Bay of Pigs in the rearview mirror and all the controversy over Greenland and everything else, I don't think there would be any incentive to do the Bay of Pigs 2.0. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be economic pressure, and we'll see what happens. I mean, Cuban people have been living off of very low income and low calorie diet for a very long time. So it's really sad, and maybe things will change. But if as Venezuela changes, it even puts more pressure on Cuba. Nicaragua is fine. I smoke a lot of cigars that come out of Nicaragua. They're doing okay. But when Cuba looks across the pond and they see $100 billion investment into Venezuela, that's also going to make them rethink, like, well, what about our investment, which they could have. It's the greatest place for resorts in the Caribbean. They could have a great tourism industry. So we'll see.
Thank you.
My very final question here, because we're coming up on time, is what do you guys think Venezuela? I mean, you mentioned reading the tea leaves earlier, which Arbon is very good at. Um, where do you guys think Venezuela is going to be a year from now? You know, this transition, again, we talked about the democratic transition. It seems as though Rubio's interested in this. It seems as though Trump's sort of iffy on it. Do you think it's more likely that Venezuela is going to sort of undergo such a transition, or is it more likely that the current elements are just going to cooperate more with Trump and say, okay, we're going to sell you oil, we're not going to do drugs, we're going to keep the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians out, and Trump will be fine with that because that's what he wants? I mean, which of these scenarios is more likely?
Okay,
Rob, you want to go first?
I'll go first. I think the decisive point in the trajectory of Venezuela's transformation is the next presidential election in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Because U.S. support for democracy in Venezuela is the primary factor in whether it makes that turn or not. And so, whether whoever is elected from whatever party 2 years from now, that will be really the decisive factor of what happens in Venezuela's trajectory. There are a lot of folks domestically who just want to see Venezuela fail because they don't like Trump. And that's really sad. Homer and I have been covering this through multiple administrations. We don't care about domestic policy. We want to see a free democracy in Venezuela, and we want to end the threat to the United States that it was becoming. And I hope that the American people would want to see that. So, to answer your question directly, there's two outcomes. One is that it just becomes like a quagmire with warring factions of Chavistas in the short term. Both Pedrino Lopez and Diosdado Cabello are not going to go out peacefully. So they'll either go out in their sleep, or they'll go to jail, or something's going to happen. That's going to happen sometime, and that could be a violent outburst. And the Rodriguez coalition does not have AK-47s, so that's going to be interesting to see how that works out. That's a very important step. I would keep my eye on how that transition takes place. But I sincerely hope that Venezuela starts making a move towards democracy. It's not going to be easy. Like I said, there's all types of factors to worry about. One is the corruption. So, just having an election doesn't give you, the democracy that the U.S. has. We need to be in there for the long haul. So I hope the U.S. population is supportive of that.
Dr. Harkins, you get the last word.
Okay, and I would say, again, I lived 5 years in Venezuela. I'm married to a Venezuelan. I love the country. There's just so much opportunity there. You can't imagine how much opportunity there is, whether you're talking about gold or tourism or beef, or it isn't just oil. We're not talking about, I love UAE, but it's oil and sand, right? There is just so much opportunity in Venezuela. And so I'm optimistic. I will say 65% chance that in a year, Padrino and Cabello are going to be either A, dead, B, in a jail cell, or C, living in Russia. And there's going to be elections. And it won't be paradise. It's not going to be utopia, but man, it's like CPR. You just start the heart again, and so I'm going to be positive. Now, I don't know. It could fall into anarchy, but I think that we're not sending in the Marines. It's not going to be that. It's not worth that. We know that. But I think given the Venezuelans half a chance, they can do something to get their country going. And I'm going to be optimistic and say a year from now, that's kind of where we're going to be. So.
I want to thank you both very much for coming on. You're phenomenal experts. This was very informative, very insightful. And we hope that we've provided some illumination on this for our audience. Obviously, there's still a lot going on. It's very complicated, and we're all going to have to keep an eye on it. But this is a remarkable time for Venezuela. and millions of people are hoping that the country will be headed in a brighter direction this year, and we share that hope. To all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to like it and to follow us on social media. Our username is @BalancingPod on Twitter or X. We're going to try and do our next episode as soon as possible on the events in Iran, which are no less captivating than those in Venezuela. We're going to have more to share soon, so please keep an eye on our social media for updates. Once again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all soon.